There's a particular kind of cruelty that hides behind laughter. Not the loud, obvious kind that leaves bruises you can point to. The quiet kind. The kind that happens in broad daylight in front of witnesses while everyone else looks away and tells themselves it isn't their business. I've kept ledgers my whole life. Columns for cattle, columns for feed, columns for rain and drought and the price of beef when the market turns mean. I started keeping them because my father told me a man who doesn't write things down will forget what matters and remember what doesn't. 40 years of ledgers, and I've filled the margins with things I couldn't put in the columns. Names, faces, moments that didn't belong anywhere else. The day I watched a room full of grown adults laugh at a 17-year-old girl because her dress was mendied at the hem, that went in the margin. What Colt Drayden did about it went in the column, because that, at least, was something I could measure. I should tell you up front, I didn't like Colt Drayden when I first met him. Rich men who wear their wealth quietly make me more nervous than the ones who flash it. The flashy ones you can read. The quiet ones keep you guessing. Colt was the quietest rich man I'd ever encountered in 30 years of Harlan County commerce, and I'd spent most of those years assuming that quiet meant calculating. I was wrong about that. I want to say it plainly before I tell you the rest, because a man should admit when he's wrong before he explains how he got there. This is the account of a girl named Nora Vane, a town that should have known better, and a man who didn't have to do a single thing he did, which is precisely why it mattered. Told from the first-person perspective of Elias Crum, keeper of ledgers, feed merchant, and reluctant witness to the better and worse angels of Harlan County, Texas, 1887. The Founders' Day auction was held the second Saturday of every September, in the yard behind the First Methodist Church, and it had been going on so long that the stakes holding the tent ropes had worn permanent grooves into the red clay earth. I'd attended every one since 1861, when I was 7 years old and my mother won a quilting basket she never once used. She kept it on the shelf above the fireplace until she died, and I still have it somewhere. That's the kind of thing Founders' Day did to people. It embedded itself. The auction that September morning in 1887 started the way they always did, with Pastor Hennick reading 3 Bible verses nobody listened to and the alderman's wife burning the coffee again. I was standing near the registration table with my ledger open, because I'd volunteered to record bids for the 3rd year running, mostly because it gave me something to do with my hands and kept me from eating too many of Marvella Hobbs's sugar biscuits. Marvella made extraordinary biscuits and had buried 2 husbands, and she had a way of looking at widowers that made me feel like I was already standing in a suit. I noticed the Vane women arrive around 9:30. There were 2 of them, Loretta Vane, who'd been a widow for going on 3 years since Calvin Vane went down with a fever that the doctor diagnosed too late, and Nora, her daughter, who was 17 that autumn and had her father's serious eyebrows and her mother's careful mouth. They came through the side gate the way people who aren't sure of their welcome always enter a place, quickly, taking up as little space as possible, eyes doing a fast survey of the crowd to locate the threat before it located them. I knew Loretta moderately well. Calvin Vane had been a dry goods man who bought feed from me twice a year, reliable and quiet, and when he died he left Loretta with a small property on the east edge of town, a modest savings account that the bank had since managed to shrink through fees and misfortune, and a reputation for stubbornness that I suspected was actually just dignity that Harlan County didn't have the vocabulary to recognize. They'd fallen on rough times, that was known. How rough I don't think most people in that yard appreciated. Nora was wearing a blue cotton dress that was clean and pressed and mendied along the hem with thread that was a half shade darker than the original fabric. You had to look to see it. I only noticed because I was standing close to the registration table when they passed, and because, I'll be honest, I notice things like that. It's the ledger habit. Details are either relevant or they aren't, and you don't know which until later. The Hargrove girls noticed it before I finished thinking about it. There were 3 of them, Bettina, Cass, and the youngest one whose name I could never retain because she seemed to change it every season based on what she'd read most recently. They were Philip Hargrove's daughters, which meant they were bank daughters, and they operated in Harlan County with the particular confidence of people who have never had to apologize for anything. They weren't bad girls in the way that makes a man use stronger language. They were the kind of bad that comes from never having been held accountable, which is almost worse because it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like weather. Bettina said something to Cass. I was 8 feet away and couldn't hear the words, but I heard the register, the low, theatrical murmur that's designed to carry just far enough. Cass laughed first, that bright, social laugh that invites others to join without explaining why. The youngest one turned to look at Nora, looked back, and laughed too. Nora heard it, I know because I watched her face. She didn't flinch. That's what struck me. She didn't flinch, didn't look down, didn't do any of the things a girl her age might do when she hears that particular kind of laughter aimed at her particular situation. She just went very still in the way that a person goes still when they've decided not to give something the satisfaction of a reaction. And then she turned her attention very deliberately to the auction table being set up near the oak tree, as if she'd been interested in it all along. Her mother hadn't heard, or she'd chosen not to, I'm not sure which. I wrote nothing in the ledger. There was nothing to write that belonged in a column. The auction started at 10 o'clock with the livestock portion, which was always the loudest and most commercial, and drew the men away from the shade into the sun where they could argue about the bloodline of a bull without worrying about tracking mud on a parlor floor. I drifted that direction myself and stood between Dob Farrett, who ran the livery, and a man I didn't recognize who was standing slightly apart from the crowd with his thumbs hooked in his pockets, and an expression of patient attention on his face that reminded me of how an engineer watches a bridge he's helped design. He was tall, not conspicuously so, but tall enough that I was aware of it. Somewhere between 40 and 50, though he carried it unevenly, the way men do when they've spent more time outdoors than in. His hat was good. Not showy, but good, the kind that costs more than it looks and lasts longer than anything cheaper. His boots were the same. His coat was work quality rather than dress quality, and he wore it like it was meant to be worn, which is to say without thinking about it. I didn't know who he was, and in Harlan County, not knowing who someone was at a Founders Day event was unusual enough to make a note of. I asked Dob in a low voice. Dob said without looking away from the bull being walked in circles, Colt Drayden, bought the old Sutherland property last spring, 8,000 acres, runs about 2,000 head. I'd heard the name. The Sutherland property purchase had been a subject of significant conversation back in April, mostly because the Sutherland heirs had been trying to sell it for a decade and nobody local had wanted to take on the debt load. And then a man from outside the county had come in and paid cash. Cash for 8,000 acres. That was the part that traveled. What do you know about him? I asked. Quiet, Dob said. Keeps to himself, pays his account same day, doesn't drink. In Harlan County, those last two were practically character references. I watched Drayden through the livestock portion of the auction. He bid twice, clinically, without the competitive energy that most men bring to auctions, the kind of energy that's really about something other than what's being sold. He won once, on a pair of young heifers that the auctioneer had underestimated and the room had failed to rally around. Drayden bid precisely what they were worth and not a cent more, and when the hammer came down, he nodded once, like a calculation completing. I found that interesting. Most men who could afford to overpay did it just to demonstrate they could afford to. The domestic auction started after a break for midday dinner, which is when the crowd reassembled in a different configuration. The men less interested now, the women more central, the atmosphere shifting from commerce to something adjacent to community performance. Quilts, baked goods, handcrafted items, household contributions. The auctioneer, a man named Pell who did this every year, and had developed a gift for turning even dishcloths into a spectacle, worked his way through the items with professional cheer. Loretta Vane had contributed a hand-embroidered table runner. I knew this because I'd seen her name on the registration sheet when I was recording items that morning. It was number 14 on the list. When it came up, Pell held it out with his usual patter, something about fine work, careful stitching, the tradition of women's craft contributing to community good. He wasn't wrong. The runner was beautiful, a vine and flower pattern in crimson and gold thread that had clearly taken weeks. Loretta Vane had not had weeks she could easily spare, which meant the piece represented something beyond its materials. The bidding started low. That wasn't unusual for domestic items, which tended to find their level slowly. But this one stayed low. The Hargrove girls, who'd been present and chattering through most of the domestic auction, went visibly quiet when the runner came up, and I saw Bettina lean toward her sister again with that same murmured communication that I'd observed that morning. What happened next was not one dramatic moment. It was a series of small ones, which in my experience is how the most effective cruelty works. Nobody bid aggressively. The few bids that came in were polite floor bids, not invested, just the social minimum. And then from somewhere in the cluster near the refreshment table, there was a burst of laughter that had no specific cause I could identify, except that it happened at the exact moment Pell was describing the runner's craftsmanship, and the timing was too particular to be accidental. Nora Vane was standing to the left of the auction table, beside her mother. I saw her look toward the laughter. Her expression didn't change much, but her jaw moved in a small, barely perceptible tightening that told me she understood the joke even if she couldn't have explained it in words. Loretta kept her eyes on the runner. The bidding stalled at 60 cents. 60 cents for weeks of her labor. Pell was making noises about going once, and the 60-cent bidder, a woman whose name I won't write down here because she later seemed genuinely embarrassed, was looking around with an expression of mild uncertainty. I was about to raise my hand and bid $1 just to move the thing forward when I saw Drayden's hand go up in my peripheral vision. $4, he said. The yard went quiet the way it does when something unexpected enters a room. $4 for a domestic auction item was not unheard of, but it was enough above the floor bid that it stopped the social physics of the moment. Pell recovered quickly, because Pell was a professional and announced the bid with his usual theater. There was a pause in which the crowd recalibrated. Then from somewhere near the Hargrove Circle, someone bid $4.50, in the flat tone of a person who's decided to make a point rather than win. Drayden said without inflection, $8. That second bid stopped the room differently. $8 in 1887 was real money for a table runner. It was money that communicated something beyond enthusiasm for embroidery. The $4.50 bidder didn't come back. Pell hammered it down with visible satisfaction, because Pell understood theater even if he didn't understand everything else that had just happened. Drayden walked to the cashier table, paid without ceremony, tucked the runner under his arm, and went back to his position at the edge of the crowd. Loretta Vane stood very straight and pressed her lips together in a way that I recognized as a woman holding back a specific feeling that she'd decided had no appropriate outlet in public. Nora was watching Drayden. I wrote the amount in my ledger, $8 lot 14. I drew a small box around it, which is something I do when a number means more than it says. After the auction proper, there was the usual loose social hour. People collecting items, settling accounts, negotiating the informal business that rural communities conduct in the presence of free coffee and obligation. I was at the registration table wrapping up the record sheets when I became aware of Drayden standing a short distance away, and Nora Vane approaching him with the directness of someone who'd made a decision and was committed to seeing it through. She wasn't performing. That was the first thing I noticed. There was no coyness, no manufactured gratitude, no social theater. She walked straight at him and said something in a voice too low for me to hear across the distance, and her chin was up at that particular angle that I recognized from her stillness earlier, the angle of someone who has decided to be proud about something that cost them the option. Drayden listened. He didn't say anything immediately, which I'd come to associate with him in just the few hours I'd observed him. He seemed congenitally disinclined to fill silence. Then he said something back, 3 or 4 words, nothing more. Nora nodded, not the small, deferential nod that women often used with men of Drayden's standing. A single, deliberate nod, the kind that completes a transaction. She went back to her mother. Drayden went back to looking at nothing in particular with his hands in his pockets. I wanted to know what they'd said. I wrote in the margin of my ledger, what did she say to him? What did he say back? It would be 2 weeks before I found out, and by then, what he'd done next had already begun. I should explain before the next part of this account what Harlan County was in 1887, not what it told itself it was, which was a community of good Christian people and honest frontier commerce and neighborly charity, but what it actually was, which was a place like most places, well-intentioned at the center, careless at the edges, and occasionally capable of cruelty it would later prefer not to remember. The Vane property sat on the east side, beyond the tannery, on land that had been good before Calvin Vane's illness, and the subsequent distraction of grief from the practical work of maintenance. The fencing was deteriorating. The kitchen garden had gone scrubby. The house itself was structurally sound, but needed work on the porch and the roof over the back bedroom where Loretta slept. Everyone knew this in the abstract way that rural communities know the circumstances of their members, acknowledged but not addressed, visible but not acted upon. I'm not a man who performs guilt easily. I've spent too many years in ledgers to pretend I don't understand where a column's been neglected. But sitting at my desk the Sunday after Founders Day, I looked at the margin note I'd made, and I felt, with some clarity, the specific discomfort of a man who has witnessed something and done nothing about the witnessing. I bid nothing on lot 14 until the last moment. I'd seen the laughter that morning and written nothing down. I'd been standing 8 feet away from something and kept my hands in my pockets. I didn't know yet what Colt Drayden intended to do. But I knew he'd done more in one bid than I'd done in 3 years of watching the veins exist at the edge of a community's attention. I wrote in the margin under the first note, "What's the right column for this?" I didn't have an answer, not that Sunday. By the end of the month, I'd find one. The first thing I heard, through Dobb, who heard it through the grain merchant's wife, which is how Harlan County's actual communications infrastructure worked, was that Colt Drayden had hired Nora Vane. Not Loretta, Nora. As a ledger keeper for the Sutherland property, or what was now the Drayden property, which was taking some time for the county to adopt as a name. He'd apparently met with her the week after Founders Day, had her demonstrate her figure's work, and offered her a position at a wage that Dobb described as considerable, and declined to specify further on the grounds that he wasn't certain of the exact number and didn't want to be wrong. The reaction to this was, in Harlan County's social economy, predictable. Among the women who'd been standing near the Hargrove Circle at Founders Day, an opinion that it was peculiar, possibly inappropriate, and probably an act of charity that would embarrass the girl. Among the men with commercial interests, a mild curiosity about what Drayden needed ledger work done for and whether the property was more complicated than it appeared. Among the people who actually thought about it, a grudging acknowledgement that Nora Vane was, in fact, known to be sharp with numbers. She'd helped her father with his accounts from the time she was 12. There was nothing in her professional qualifications to object to. Bettina Hargrove, I was told, expressed the opinion that it was condescending. I wrote that down in the margin too, not because it was insightful, but because I wanted a record of irony. I saw Nora for the first time after she'd started at the Drayden property on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when she came into my shop to purchase a set of blank ledger books and a quantity of ink. She ordered 3 ledger books of the large-ruled variety, and paid with coins that she counted out with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they have and intends to use it precisely. I asked, because the social contract of a small-town shop permits it, how she was finding the work. She said, "It's real work," and then, after a pause that suggested she'd decided I was worth a complete sentence, "He doesn't ask me to make the numbers look like something they're not. He just asks me to find what they are." I thought about that as I wrapped the ledger books. "That's a rare quality," I said, "in an employer or anyone else." She almost smiled. It wasn't the full thing, it was the structural suggestion of one, the kind that lives around the eyes before it decides whether to commit to the mouth. "He told me the books had been kept in pencil for 3 years, she said. "Every column provisional, nobody willing to commit to ink." "And you?" "I work in ink," she said. She tucked the ledger books under her arm, with exactly the same motion, I noticed, that Drayden had tucked her mother's table runner at Founders Day, and walked out into the September afternoon. I stood at the counter for a moment with my hands flat on the wood. Then I opened my own ledger and wrote in the column, not the margin, the column, one word, provisional. I crossed it out. That was the column for things that weren't any more. October came to Harlan County the way it always did, not gradually, but in a single committed morning when you woke up and the light was different and the mesquite had made a decision. By the first week of the month, the auction yard tent had been put away for another year. The Hargrove girls had retreated into their winter social calendar, and I had convinced myself that the story of Colt Drayden and Nora Vane was a minor one, the kind of thing that makes a man feel better about humanity for a few days, and then recedes into the ordinary texture of commerce and weather. I was wrong about that, too. The second thing I heard, again through the informal network that connected Dobb to the grain merchant's wife to my shop counter, was that Drayden had begun making inquiries. Not about land or cattle, which would have been in his business interest and therefore unremarkable, about Vane property. Specifically about the eastern fencing situation, the roof, the state of the accounts against the property from 3 years of deferred maintenance. My first reaction, which I'm not proud of, was a small suspicion. I know what I said earlier about quiet rich men making me nervous, and I want to be precise. The suspicion I felt was not about Drayden's character, which had given me no reason for doubt. It was about the shape of the situation. A wealthy man making financial inquiries about a widow's property is a pattern that has a history in frontier economies, and the history is not uniformly kind. Men acquire land from widows in distress by various mechanisms, some of them generous seeming on the surface. I wrote the suspicion down in the margin so I would remember I'd had it, which is a habit that keeps me honest. If I'm wrong about a man, I want a record of when I doubted him so that the record of being wrong is complete. I was wrong, but I'll tell you what I learned and let you track the correction yourself. The first concrete thing I witnessed directly, rather than through the network, was on a Wednesday morning in the second week of October. I was driving a wagon load of feed out along the east road toward the Demarocks property, which took me past the Vane land, and I observed, at a considerable distance and without stopping, a crew of 4 men working on the eastern fence line. The fence line that belonged to the Vane property. I pulled up on the reins and sat with the wagon stopped for a moment, watching. The men were working with the focused efficiency of people who have been told exactly what needs doing and given the materials to do it. New posts, new wire. Someone had surveyed the breakpoints in advance and supplied the precise quantities because there was no waste visible, no excess wire coiled on the ground, no extra lumber leaning against fence posts. I drove on, but I turned back when I reached the Vane property's north gate and went up the track to the house, because, I'll be straightforward about this, I was doing what I always do when I encounter something that doesn't fit a pattern I understand, which is to go get more data. Loretta Vane was in the kitchen garden, which was beginning to look marginally less scrubby than it had been, and she looked up when I pulled in with the expression of a woman who's accustomed to assessing whether approaching men represent obligation or information. I said, gesturing vaguely toward the fence line, "That's a crew at your east fence." "It is," she said. "Drayden's people. He sent them Monday," she said. "Said it needed doing and he had a crew free." I waited. Loretta Vane was not the kind of woman who needed prompting. She was the kind of woman who gave you information in her own time. "He came out himself last week," she said. "Walked the fence line with Nora. She showed him the break points. He didn't say much. Came back 2 days later with the crew and the materials." "Did he say anything about?" "No," she said it clean, without roughness, not defensive, just precise. "He didn't make it an arrangement. He didn't set a price. He didn't make any offer that required an answer. He just sent the crew." I thought about that. That's an unusual way to do a thing. "Yes," she said, and then quietly, "It is." She went back to the kitchen garden. I drove back out to the east road. Behind me, the sound of post drivers and wire being stretched carried in the October morning air, steady and methodical. In the margin of my ledger that evening, I wrote, "He walked the fence line with her daughter first." I underlined the last word. It seemed important that it was Nora who'd been the one to show him where the breaks were, not Loretta asking for help. Nora doing her job, which was to know the situation of the land, and Drayden responding to what the job surfaced rather than to the charity of a widow's distress. There's a difference between those things. I'm not sure I could have articulated it cleanly that evening, but I felt it clearly enough to underline a word. The fence was finished in 3 days. A week after that, Dobb told me that a pair of carpenters had been observed at the Vane property working on the porch. The week after that, the back bedroom roof. This is where I began to have a different kind of problem with what I was observing, and I want to be honest about it because honesty is what a ledger is for. The repairs were on one level obviously good. The Vane property needed them, Loretta Vane could not afford them, and Drayden had the means and apparently the will. There was nothing exploitative in how it was being executed, no obligations extracted, no visible conditions. The crew came, did the work, left. Nora continued to work her hours at the Drayden property and was paid for them. But Harlan County was watching. And in a county that watches, the story being told about what you're doing matters almost as much as what you're actually doing. The story being told about the fence repairs, as best I could reconstruct it from the various sources that flowed through my shop counter, was divided. One version, Colt Drayden was a decent man who saw a legitimate need and addressed it out of simple human decency, which was admirable and none of anyone else's business. Another version, Colt Drayden had an interest in the vain widow that he was pursuing through material generosity, which would eventually require some form of reciprocation, and was therefore not purely altruistic. A third version, quieter and mostly circulating among the women who'd known the Hargrove girls for years, that Drayden was making a point, and the point wasn't about fencing. I found the third version most interesting because I suspected it was partially correct, though probably not in the way the people circulating it intended. There was, I was beginning to think, something deliberate about what Drayden was doing, but deliberate in the way that a man is deliberate when he has a considered moral position about a situation, not deliberate in the way a man is deliberate when he's engineering an outcome for his own benefit. I was still not certain. The ledger habit requires evidence, not intuition. I got the evidence I was looking for in the last week of October, when I ran into Colt Drayden at the grain merchant's, and he asked if I'd have a cup of coffee. He drank his coffee black, which I noted because I've found it's a reliable proxy for nothing in particular, but I always notice it anyway. We sat at the table near the grain merchant's side window that looked out on the street, and there was a dry wind moving dust along the boards, and he looked at it the way a man looks at weather when he's used to reading it for information. I didn't make him introduce the subject. I said, "People are talking about the work on the Vane property." "I know," he said. "Some of them have opinions about your reasons." "I know that too." He didn't seem disturbed by it. Not in the performed way of a man who's decided in advance to appear untroubled, but in the flat way of a man who has genuinely accounted for the social cost of a thing and decided it wasn't the relevant consideration. I said, "I'm not asking for your reasons. I'm telling you the talk exists because you should know if you don't." "I appreciate that," he said. There was a pause. Outside, the wind moved along the street. "She's good at her work," he said, not as a pivot, as a continuation of a thought he'd been in the middle of before I spoke. Nora Vaned. She found a discrepancy in the Eastern pasture assessments that 3 years of previous bookkeeping had missed. 3 years. She found it in 4 days. He looked at his coffee. "The position I offered her isn't charity. It's a position I needed filled by someone who could fill it." "I believe you," I said, and I did. "The fence needed fixing," he said. "The roof needed fixing. The reasons for why they'd been left unfixed were not complicated." I waited. "I heard the laughter at Founders Day," he said. "I want to be clear that I'm not telling you that as an explanation for why I did what I did. The property needed work, and she was already doing work for me, and I had a crew available. Those are the reasons." "But," I said. He looked at me. There was something in the directness of it that I wasn't used to from men who had what he had. Most of them looked slightly past you, as if the more important conversation was always happening just over your shoulder. "But," he said, "I spent 22 years building the Sutherland property into what it is. I started with $40 and a rented horse, and I was laughed at by men who are still renting horses. I know what that laughter is. I know exactly what it's designed to do." He set down his coffee. "It's designed to make a person believe what other people have decided about them before they've had a chance to decide themselves. I have a significant objection to that." He said objection the way a man says it when the word means something precise. Not a feeling, a position. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, because it seemed like the right question, "Did Nora ask you for any of it? The fence, the roof?" "No," he said. "Did you tell her before you did it?" "No," he said. "I told her mother." "Why the mother and not her?" He picked up his coffee again. "Because Nora Vane is 17 years old and she is already conducting herself like someone who has decided she will not be defined by what she doesn't have. I wasn't going to make her ask for something she shouldn't have had to ask for." He paused. "Her mother is the head of that household. That's who you tell." I thought about the table runner. $8. the way Nora had walked across the yard toward him after the auction with her chin at that angle. "She came and thanked you herself at Founder's Day," I said. "I saw it." "She did," he said. "She told me it was the fairest bid in the room." I thought about that. Was that all she said? He looked out the window. "She said she'd remember it." He set down his coffee. "Not the bid, the fairness." The wind moved outside. A dog crossed the street. I opened my ledger on the table. Habit, purely habit. I wasn't planning to write anything. And then I closed it again without writing anything, which is something I almost never do. "The Hargrove Circle is saying the work on the property is you developing an interest," I said, not cruelly. He needed to know. "I'm aware of what the Hargrove Circle is saying," he said. "Philip Hargrove has been trying to acquire the Vane land's eastern parcel for 2 years. The Hargrove girls didn't learn their opinions in a vacuum." I sat very still. "The land's eastern fence line borders the Hargrove grazing allotment," Drayden said, with the tone of a man explaining a column rather than making an accusation. "A property in disrepair is a property whose owner is in a weakened position to resist acquisition offers. I noticed that when I walked the fence line." "You think—" "I don't think anything that isn't in the land registry," he said. "I'm telling you what's in the land registry." I looked at my closed ledger. "Hargrove's been—" "Making offers," Drayden said. "I know because Loretta Vane mentioned it. The most recent offer came in August. She declined it. The property was in worse shape in August than it is now." I thought about Bettina Hargrove's voice at Founder's Day. The laughter at the 60-cent bidding floor for Loretta Vane's table runner. "So the laughter wasn't random," I said. "Very little is," he said. He finished his coffee, paid for both cups without making a thing of it, and walked out into the dry October wind. I sat at the table with my closed ledger and thought about the difference between what I'd assumed was small social cruelty and what it had actually been, which was the visible surface of something with a bottom to it. I opened the ledger. I wrote in the column, not the margin, the land registry, check the eastern parcel. I wrote below it, not random. And below that, in smaller letters, the thing I'd finally found the right column for, what a man does when he understands the whole pattern. I checked the land registry 2 days later, on a Friday, using the access that my position as a county auction recorder occasionally granted me to administrative documents. I'm not going to detail everything I found because some of it isn't mine to record, but I will say that the pattern Drayden had indicated was visible in the documents once you knew what you were looking for. Philip Hargrove, through 2 different agent names, had made 3 acquisition inquiries about the Vane property's eastern parcel in the 18 months since Calvin Vane's death. The most recent was dated August of 1887, 6 weeks before Founder's Day. The Hargrove grazing allotment did border the eastern fence line. A fence in the condition the Vane fence had been in, deteriorating, poorly marked, partially collapsed in 2 sections, was the kind of ambiguity that made property disputes easier to initiate and harder to defend. I'm not saying Philip Hargrove orchestrated his daughter's social behavior at the Founder's Day auction. I'm saying that families communicate their values in ways that don't require explicit instruction. Children learn what their parents find important, what their parents find contemptible, and what stands in the way of what their parents want. That education is thorough and rarely written down. What Drayden had done, the fence repair, the roof work, the hiring, had, among its other effects, substantially stabilized the Vane property's defensive position. A fence that's sound, clearly marked, and properly maintained is harder to dispute. A property whose owner is employed at a neighboring ranch has both income and a visible professional relationship with an adjacent landowner of considerable standing. A widow whose daughter brings home wages is not a widow in the same degree of vulnerability as a widow whose daughter is being laughed at by the bank president's girls. These were not altruistic calculations. Or rather, they were altruistic in their effect and calculating in their execution, which is a combination I hadn't encountered often enough in 47 years to take for granted. I went home and opened my ledger to the entry from the grain merchant's table. I added 1 more line at the bottom of the column. He walked the fence line first because he was reading the situation, not performing it. That was the difference. I've been trying to find it for 3 weeks, and now I had it. The last thing I want to record from October is smaller than the fence or the roof, or the land registry, and it may be more important than any of them. I was at the post office on a Thursday afternoon, the 21st, I believe, and Nora Vane was at the counter ahead of me mailing something. When she turned and saw me, she stopped, not awkwardly, deliberately. She looked at me for a moment with those serious eyebrows and that careful mouth, and then she said, quietly but without any particular privacy about it, "Mr. Crumb, did you bid on my mother's table runner at Founder's Day?" I said honestly, "I was going to, someone else got there first." She considered this. "Would you have bid $1?" "I'd have bid $2," I said. "Maybe $3 if I'd had more coffee." She almost smiled again. It was still the structural suggestion of one, but it was slightly closer to committed than the one in September. "He bid $8," she said. "I know, I recorded it." "Did you know why?" "Not at the time," I said. "I have a theory now." She looked at me for a moment. "He told me once," she said, "that the best bid in any room is the one that reflects what something is actually worth, not what the room has decided to make it worth." She tucked her envelope under her arm. "He said the room is usually wrong." She walked out. I stood at the post office counter and looked at the clerk, who was looking at me. I said, "Did you catch any of that?" He shrugged, something about bidding. "Yes," I said, "something like that." I mailed my letter and went back to my shop and wrote nothing for an hour, which is very unlike me. I just sat with the ledger open and thought about rooms and what they decide things are worth and who pays the cost when they're wrong. November came cold. Not the theatrical cold of northern winters that I'd read about in eastern papers, the kind with its own literature and its own specific brand of suffering. Texas cold is different. It's dry and it cuts, and it doesn't ask permission, and it turns everything the color of something that's making a decision about whether to survive until spring. The mesquite looked like wire diagrams. The sky went the color of a pewter plate left too long on a shelf. I had been keeping the ledger since September, and by early November it was getting crowded in the margins. That happens when I'm paying close attention to something. The columns stay clean, but the margins fill up with the things that don't fit the established categories, and eventually I have to start a new section. I started a new section in the first week of November. I titled it, because I title sections, it's another habit, what changes. The first entry was, Philip Hargrove made a fourth offer on the Vane Eastern parcel. The second entry, Loretta Vane declined it. The third, Hargrove went to speak with Drayden about it directly. That third entry is where the November part of this account begins, because what happened at that conversation was, according to Dobb, who had it from the livery boy who witnessed the beginning of it in the street outside the grain merchants, not at all what Philip Hargrove expected. Philip Hargrove was a man who had the kind of physical confidence that comes from spending enough decades in a town that you've stopped distinguishing between your own presence and the town's center of gravity. He was thick through the shoulders, gray at the temples, with the deliberate pace of a man who knows the street will wait for him. He dressed well in a specific way, not flashy, but formal, always formal, as if the social contract required a visible demonstration of investment. He found Drayden outside the grain merchants on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November. Dobb had described the encounter, and I'm going to reconstruct it as accurately as I can, accounting for the livery boy's perspective and the inevitable compression of oral transmission. Hargrove said he wanted to talk about the Vane property. He said it in the tone of a man who has rehearsed the opening and is confident of the terrain. Drayden said he wasn't sure what about the Vane property Hargrove wanted to discuss with him. Hargrove said he understood that Drayden had a working relationship with the Vane family and wanted to discuss what he'd characterized as the improving situation there. Specifically, whether Drayden had an interest in the eastern parcel himself, because if so, they could perhaps come to an arrangement. Drayden said no. Hargrove clarified. Did Drayden mean no, he had no interest, or no, he wasn't interested in an arrangement? Drayden said both. There was a pause, according to the livery boy's account. Then Hargrove said, with the particular register of a man invoking community authority, that the Vane property had been in a precarious situation for some time, and that the improvements recently made didn't change the underlying financial reality, and that a fair offer made now was a better outcome for Loretta Vane than a protracted situation that didn't resolve. Drayden said that Loretta Vane's assessment of what constituted a better outcome for Loretta Vane was hers to make. Hargrove said that a woman in her situation needed. Drayden said quietly the word no. Not as a counter-argument, not as a prelude, just the word by itself in the flat tone that ends a line of reasoning rather than responding to it. Hargrove left. The livery boy said he walked away with the pace of a man who'd been handed information he wasn't going to find useful and was in the process of recategorizing it. I wrote in the margin just the word by itself. I thought about that for a long time, the word no as a complete sentence. In 47 years of commerce and frontier negotiation and auction recording, I had heard no used as the opening bid of a counteroffer, as a social courtesy before a yes, as a delay mechanism, as a performance of reluctance preceding agreement. I had rarely heard it used as its own final complete statement by a man in a position to say yes without consequence. It requires a very particular kind of stillness to do that. The kind that doesn't come from wealth, because wealth usually opens more options rather than simplifying them. It comes from somewhere else. I didn't know exactly where Drayden's came from, but I thought it had something to do with $40 and a rented horse, and 22 years of building something while people laughed, and knowing, with the full-body knowledge that only experience gives, exactly what the laughter is designed to do and choosing not to let it do it. November's second event, and I'm calling it an event though it was really just a conversation, but some conversations are events in the same way that some stones are load-bearing, happened at my shop on a Friday afternoon. Nora came in for ink. She had developed a regular rhythm of supply purchases, always precise in her quantities, always with exact payment. She'd started wearing her hair differently, not dramatically, not the kind of transformation that announces itself. Just pinned back instead of braided, the way a woman wears it when she's been working at a desk and the braid becomes an inconvenience, a small adjustment toward function. She had ink-stained fingers, which I noted because I noticed that kind of thing. She paid and I wrapped the ink, and then she didn't leave immediately, which was unusual enough to register. She said without preamble, "The Hargrove land agent was at our property yesterday." I set down the wrapping paper. "Which one?" "The one they use for the Eastern offers." He said it was a courtesy call. She said courtesy call with the flat precision of a person quoting words they don't believe in. He said they were aware the recent improvements had changed things, and they wanted to update their assessment of the property's value. "What did your mother say?" "My mother was in town. I was there." She met my eyes. I told him the property wasn't for sale, wasn't in a position where selling it made sense, and that any further courtesy calls should be directed through our legal correspondence. I looked at her. She was 17 years old. "You said all that?" I paraphrased, she said. What I actually said was more direct. "Do you have legal correspondence?" She paused for approximately half a second. "I do now. Mr. Drayden put me in contact with the county recorder's office last week, and through them, I was referred to a land representation firm in San Antonio that handles small property defense cases. I stopped. He connected you with a legal representative." "Through the recorder's office," she said. "He didn't involve himself directly. He just mentioned that I might find it useful to know who to speak to." I thought about the distinction, the recorder's office rather than his own attorney, a referral rather than an arrangement, information rather than intervention. "He keeps doing that," I said mostly to myself. "Doing what?" "Making it possible for you to do things yourself," I said, "instead of doing them for you." She looked at me with those serious eyebrows. "Yes," she said. "He does." There was a pause. Outside, the November wind moved along the boards. "Does it bother you?" I asked. "The Hargrove attention?" "It bothers me," she said carefully, "that the attention exists at all. It doesn't make me afraid." She looked at the wrapped ink. "It did make me afraid in September at the auction when I heard—" She stopped, corrected course. "When I heard the laughter." I waited. "I knew what it was about," she said. "I knew it wasn't about my dress." "What do you think it was about?" "A decision someone had made," she said, "about what I was worth. About what we were worth, my mother's work and our situation, and whether we were people whose circumstances mattered." She said it with the steady delivery of something that had been thought through, not something raw. I was angry. Then I was— She paused again. Then I decided the decision was wrong, not just unfair, wrong, like an error in a column. And then, and then I walked across the yard and I spoke to a man who'd made a different assessment, she said, and I wanted him to know that I'd noticed the difference. She picked up her ink. I work in ink, she added, and it took me a moment to realize she was repeating what she'd said to me 6 weeks earlier, not as a reiteration, but as a statement that had extended its own meaning while she wasn't watching it. She left. I stood at the counter for a long time in the November light. I need to tell you about the night of the county board meeting in the 3rd week of November, because it was the last major thing I witnessed directly before this account reaches its end, and because what happened there was, in its quiet, procedural way, the most significant event in the story of what Colt Drayden did and what it changed. The county board met on the 3rd Thursday of each month to address property disputes, commercial complaints, and the ordinary administrative texture of a frontier county. I attended because recording attendance and decisions was part of my volunteer capacity, and I had attended every session for 11 years with the dutiful boredom of a man doing necessary work. That November, an item appeared on the agenda that I'd known was coming from the moment I'd seen the land registry and understood the Hargrove pattern, a formal inquiry into the surveying records of the Vane property's eastern boundary. The inquiry was filed by a land agent representing an undisclosed commercial interest, which is legal, and which everyone in the room understood was Philip Hargrove by another name. The argument was that certain historical survey markers on the eastern fence line were ambiguous enough to warrant a formal resurvey, which would temporarily complicate the property's boundary status and potentially require a legal process to resolve. It was, in other words, a manufactured dispute designed to create uncertainty. I'd seen it done before. It's a patient strategy. You create a cloud over a title, you offer to resolve the cloud through acquisition, you wait. In a county where legal resources were uneven and the court calendar was crowded, a manufactured dispute could sit unresolved for years, during which time the property owner existed in a state of anxious limbo that made the acquisition offer look better every month. Loretta Vane was present. She sat in the 2nd row with her hands folded in her lap and the expression of a woman who understood exactly what was being done and was measuring the available responses. Nora was beside her, with a leather-bound folio on her knees. The land agent presented the inquiry with professional efficiency. He was good at his job. He framed the ambiguity as a service to property clarity rather than a challenge to ownership. He cited historical survey dates with authority, and he was careful to avoid anything that constituted an explicit accusation. Then the board chairman asked if there were any respondents. Nara opened the folio. She stood up. She was 17 years old, wearing the blue dress that was mended at the hem, and she stood in front of the county board with exactly the bearing she'd had walking across the Founders' Day yard, chin at the particular angle that indicated a decision had been made and was not provisional. She presented a document. The document was a survey report, current, completed 6 days earlier by a licensed county surveyor, the same one the board used for its own official work. It documented every boundary marker on the Vane eastern property line with precise measurements, notations, and photographic reference where applicable. It was thorough in the way that something is thorough when the person who commissioned it understood the difference between a document that defends against scrutiny and a document that invites it. She explained the document with the clear, unhurried delivery of someone who has practiced being clear in front of rooms that were waiting to find a reason to dismiss her, and had decided to give them nothing to find. The land agent, I observed, had not expected a current survey. He'd expected an old one, the kind that had the ambiguities built in by time. A current survey done by the board's own preferred surveyor gave him nothing to work with. The board chairman read through the document. He asked 2 questions. Nora answered both. The board chairman said, with the specific economy of a man who has decided a thing isn't going anywhere, that the survey records appeared to be in order and that no basis for further inquiry was established at this time. The inquiry was dismissed. The land agent gathered his papers with the controlled precision of someone who is professionally unperturbed by setbacks and is already calculating the next approach. He left without speaking to anyone. Loretta Vane let out a breath that was barely audible from where I was sitting, but I was sitting close, and I heard it. Nora sat back down, closed the folio, and held it on her knees. In the chair against the wall at the back of the room, Colt Drayden, who had said nothing, raised no hand, and presented no documentation, was watching the front of the room with the expression of a man whose calculation has resolved exactly as he expected. He'd been there the whole meeting. I'd seen him come in before it started and take the chair in the back row, the one against the wall, the one where you can see everything and nobody needs to ask you why you're there. He'd sat through the entire agenda with his arms folded, and his hat on his knee, and that expression of patient attention that I'd first noticed watching him at the livestock auction in September. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't needed to. He needed to do exactly what he'd done. 3 weeks earlier, connect Nora Vane to the land representation firm in San Antonio through the recorder's office. The firm, apparently, had provided the referral to the surveyor. The surveyor had done the work. Nora had commissioned, collected, and presented the results. He hadn't stood up in front of the board for her. He'd made it possible for her to stand up in front of the board for herself. I looked at him across the room, and he looked at me briefly and nodded once. Like a calculation completing. After the meeting, in the cold November night outside the county hall, I stood with my ledger under my arm and watched people disperse toward their horses and their wagons and their lantern-lit homes. And I was doing what I do after witnessing something significant, which is standing still long enough to understand it before I write it down. Loretta and Nora passed near me on their way to the gate. Loretta paused. She looked at me with the same measuring expression she'd had when I pulled up to her kitchen garden in October, assessing information versus obligation. "Mr. Crum," she said. "Mrs. Vane." She looked at me for a moment. "You've been paying attention." "It's what I do," I said. She nodded slowly. "Write it accurately," she said, and then she and Nora went through the gate. I stood there a moment more. Drayden came out last, after most of the board members, and he paused beside me the way men pause when they have one thing left to say and want to say it correctly. He said, "She found 2 more discrepancies in the Eastern pasture assessments this week." "Nora, she's going to be a formidable bookkeeper," he said. "Maybe more than that." I thought about more than that. I thought about what a 17-year-old girl who worked in ink, who stood up in front of a county board with a folio on her arm, who remembered the fairness in a room rather than the bid amount. What she might be, given time and the chance to find out. "Did you know the survey would do it?" I asked. "Cut the inquiry off." "I knew a current survey would establish what the records already showed," he said. "What the records showed was never the question." "No," I said. "The question was whether anyone would bother to document it." "She bothered," he said. "That's the only reason it worked." He put his hat on and walked to his horse. I watched him mount and ride, not dramatically, not with any particular theater, just riding toward the road that would take him south, toward the 8,000-acre property that had been built with $40 and a rented horse and 22 years of building in the face of everything that told him not to. I went home. I sat at my desk. I opened the ledger to the November section, the one I'd titled What Changes. I thought about what to write. I thought about columns and margins, and the difference between what you record and what you witness and what you understand. Then I wrote the first thing in the column. The inquiry was dismissed. And below it, she stood up in front of the board. She opened the folio. She had prepared the document herself, with resources she'd found herself, through channels that someone had quietly made available. And below that, nobody stood up for her, nobody needed to. I thought about the margin and what to put there. I thought about the table runner and the fence line and the way a single word, "no," can complete a sentence when nothing follows it because nothing is supposed to. I thought about the laughter that had been designed to do a specific thing and had failed to do it. Not because someone had fought it, but because someone had looked at it clearly enough to understand its purpose, and had declined to be shaped by the purpose. I thought about what Founders' Day laughter is really for. Then I wrote in the margin, in small letters, the last entry in this account. She told him she'd remember the fairness, not the bid, the fairness. The room is usually wrong. This one was. I'm closing this section of the ledger now. I'll start a new one in the spring. I always do. It's the habit of a man who marks seasons by what he records rather than what he lives through. By spring, what I've recorded will already be partly in the past, which is where things need to go before you can understand them properly. What I know, as of November 1887. The Vane Eastern fence line is sound and clearly marked. Nora Vane is employed, working in ink, and has legal representation on file with the county recorder's office. Philip Hargrove has not made a fifth offer. Bettina Hargrove, I'm told, attended a social function last week at which Nora Vane was also present, and did not say anything in particular, and the room was quiet in a different way than it was at Founder's Day. Colt Drayden rode out on Tuesday for the eastern pasture to look at what Nora's new discrepancy findings indicated about the soil mapping, which is apparently a separate problem with its own set of remedies and will require attention in the spring. And me, I am a man with a ledger and 47 years and a shop that smells like feed grain and ink. And I have been a witness to things this autumn that I couldn't have written in the columns when they were happening, because I didn't yet have the category for them.